Hey guys. So normally we don't do this. We don't do song requests. But apparently, is it today or tomorrow? Today? Tomorrow. Tomorrow is, remind me your name one more time. Samara? Samara. Tomorrow is Samara's birthday. That kind of rhymes. So we're going to sing her happy birthday just because I got asked to do it. You know what? We're all just going to sing happy birthday, and if you know somebody whose birthday is today or tomorrow, just put their name in when we get to the part where you put the name in. All right, 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Samara, and anybody else's birthdays this week. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Samara. That's really fun. Like I said, normally we don't do that, but I guess if you come up to me 2 seconds before I start talking, then I'll get everybody to sing happy birthday. My name is Larry. I've been on staff here for a couple of years. And one of my favorite things, one of my favorite events that we do here is Unplugged. Anybody ever been to an Unplugged? Yeah, okay. I think generally people like it. I think it's a pretty fun event. I'm not going to announce it or anything, so we're like a long ways away from Unplugged. I am curious though, because this is high school, and so how many of you came to the very first Unplugged that we did? Came to the very first Unplugged that we did. Okay. So if you were at the very first Unplugged, then you may remember what I'm about to tell you. If you don't know what I'm about to tell you, like if you don't know this story, then I'm very envious of you. So is Luke Overby in here? Luke, will you stand up for me? You don't have to come on stage. I just want you to stand up right where you are. So before I tell you this story, I just want you guys to know I love you, Luke. Luke, I love you so much. No, stand up. No, you're the star of the show right now. So has anybody ever been in a situation where you got in trouble and you tried really hard to present this case like you did nothing wrong? You ever been in that situation? Okay. And how many of you knew that you did something wrong, though? You ever been there? Raise your hand if you've ever been in that situation. Okay, most of us. Well, I'm going to single out one guy. Like I said, Luke, I love you. But at the very first Unplugged, there was one of these situations. And essentially what had happened, I'm probably going to get some of these details wrong. There was, outside of the 11th grade guy's room, there was Kool-Aid, like the powder kind, that had been not only spread out the carpet in this place that was not ours that we were staying at, but it had been wet to the point that it had seeped into the carpet. And then, to top it all off, it had been vacuumed over so as to try and ruin that area of the carpet. And now, a couple people got asked, hey, do you know what's going on? Do you know who did this? And there was one name that continued to get brought up in all of that. And that was the guy who's scratching his head like he doesn't know what I'm talking about right now. And I remember going to Luke because I had heard so many people, enough people to where it was very obvious who had done this. And I'm pretty sure there was Kool-Aid powder like in your bag where you had like opened it over your bag. I don't really remember. Like I said, I'm getting a little foggy. My point being, there was no way in the world that Luke was going to be able to convince me or even himself that he did not do this. And yet, bold Luke Overby did his best to try and plead his case as to why this was not him, and it was not him who did it. And I'm pretty sure you never admitted at that Unplugged. Am I right? Did you ever admit there that you did it? Yeah. He was going to take it to the grave, except for the fact that about an hour ago, I asked Luke by the ping pong table before I got up here and told this story. I said, Luke, did you put that Kool-Aid on the carpet? And he just started laughing. And what did you say? Yeah, exactly. You can have a seat, Luke. So I was going to tell this whole story about me and my grandparents when I was a kid and how I got caught, but I just remembered that story earlier today, and I thought, this is perfect. Because I think all of us have found ourselves in a situation like that, where we have clearly done wrong, and even when presented with a case that is rock solid to prove us guilty, we will still fight and hold on to the lie that we did nothing wrong. See, a couple of weeks ago, we started this series about Hosea. And we saw the first couple of weeks how God's choosing of an unfaithful people and his just judgment on that unfaithful people and his relentless pursuit are true of us today. And we saw the marriage between Hosea and Gomer, about how Hosea went and he sought after this unfaithful wife, Gomer. And we saw last week how this picture of their marriage was the picture of God's just judgment on sin, but also his relentless pursuit of you and I. And so what we're going to do now, because the story is not done. Hosea, the book of Hosea is not finished. And so there's still quite a bit more for us to cover. But what we're going to see today and tonight as we look at chapters 4 and 5 is this case that God is presenting against the Israelites. Because the Israelites, while they might have been convinced themselves that they were an innocent people, they were far from it. They were very guilty. And so we're going to see this kind of case that the Lord presents to them. We're going to go pretty fast through tonight, and I want you guys to know there's a lot in chapters 4 and 5 that we're not going to have time to cover. And so I would just encourage you to go on your own or maybe with a friend this week and read through chapters 4 and 5. And just as you have questions, as you read things and you're like, I don't know what that means, write them down and bring them back to your leaders, bring them back to Tucker, Steph, and I, and we would be happy to help you walk through whatever passages, whatever parts that we don't get through tonight. But I'm going to cover kind of the big pictures of chapters 4 and 5. And here's what we see. God's case against the Israelites is because of three things in the land: ignorance, idolatry, and imitation. And we're going to see how each of these three things were sins that the Israelites allowed to remain and persisted in this time. And so, like I said, we're going to skip over a lot, and so be sure to go and read that on your own. But I want to walk through each of these three things and see how these things were present in the land at the time, and then also how it relates to you and I today. And so, first one, the Israelites were guilty for their ignorance of God, We see in chapter 4, verse 1, "Hear the word of the Lord, people of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land." Now, if I or your parents or anybody else comes to you and they're like, I have a case against you, you might think that you can argue it. But if you hear God has a case against you, then I would just go ahead and wrap it up and push it in, because there's no arguing this. And so what does he say? There is no truth, no faithful love, and no knowledge of God in the land. And so what he's saying to the Israelites is, no one knows about me anymore. No one knows my law, my word, the truth that I have taught you for generations. We also see in verse 6 of chapter 4, "My people are destroyed." Why? "For lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. And I will reject you from serving as my priest, since you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your sons." And so we see that there was a clear rejection, a clear abandoning of not just God and his character, but his laws and his words that he had given to his chosen people. And see, what many of us know by either experience or you can look out into the world today, as we reject and abandon God's law and his teaching, and we reject knowing God, sin is sure to follow. We are sure to spiral into a lifestyle and a world of sin. We'll bounce back to verse 2, and we see that this is what resulted. As the people rejected, as they didn't have a knowledge of God, as they were ignorant of him and his teachings, cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery are rampant. One act of bloodshed follows another. We're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but as you read this, just think about our world today. Think about as we look out and as you walk through the halls of your schools, or maybe for some of you, even in your own family. Cursing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery. We see that murder rates are crazy because people have abandoned the law. People have abandoned a knowledge of God. And so it is very sure for us that these are the things that are going to follow a world, a society, a heart that is void of the knowledge of God and of his word and his law. And so we see first that the Israelites were ignorant of God and the things of God, of his word. But we also see that Israel was guilty for their idolatry of false gods. Now, we have repeated this ad nauseum over the last couple of weeks. Like, I am sure you are tired of hearing the words adultery and idolatry, because that is if you had to pick one word to describe the nation of Israel in this time, it would have been either adulterous or idolatrous or promiscuous. And we actually see that in chapters 4 and 5, these words are used to either describe them outright or are inferred 20 times. And God is driving home the point, Hosea is driving home the point that Israel had fallen victim to worshiping gods that were not the one true God. I want us to just read in chapter 4, verses 10 through 15, and I want you to just acknowledge and look at how many times he calls them promiscuous or adulterous or idolatrous. It says, they will eat but not be satisfied. They will be promiscuous but not multiply, for they have abandoned their devotion to the Lord. Promiscuity, new wine, take away one's understanding. My people consult their wooden idols and their divining rods to inform them, for a spirit of promiscuity leads them astray. They act promiscuously in disobedience to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops. They burn offerings on the hills and under oaks and poplars and terebinths, because their shade is pleasant. And I want to talk about this for a second, because I think we can read like they sacrifice on the mountaintops, they burn offerings on the hills, and we can get a little confused. Because if you read through the Old Testament, we understand that the Israelites were instructed to offer sacrifices to God. That in and of itself was not a bad thing to do. God had told them to do that, but that's not what we read here. You see, they weren't offering these things to Yahweh, to the one true God anymore. No, you see, they were finding gods, false gods to offer these things to that promised them prosperity and promised them pleasant shade. And I think that's a lot of times where we can fall victim to that. We can hear the promises and the temptation to worship false gods in hope that they would be able to fill the void in our hearts. And you see, that's what the Israelites were doing. They were going after these other gods and offering them sacrifices that were meant for Yahweh, for the one true God. And we keep reading, and so your daughters acted promiscuously, and your daughter-in-law committed adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they act promiscuously, or your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go off with prostitutes and make sacrifices with cult prostitutes. They're losing the leaders. The men have gone off and they've fallen prey not only to these false gods in worship, and it's not just an image for the false gods, but they were literally sexually immoral, and they were leading their people astray in that way. People without discernment are doomed. Israel, if you act promiscuously, don't let Judah become guilty. Do not go to Gilgal or make pilgrimage to Beth-aven, and do not swear an oath as the Lord lives. And so we see he is driving home the point that the Israelites had fallen victim to this sin of idolatry, and they were guilty because of it. And then the last one. Israel was guilty for their imitation of the things of God. And this was one that as I was reading this passage and trying to study and see how it applies to our life, I was extremely convicted. Because I think on the outset, this can be a confusing thing to be guilty for, right? It's a good thing to do the things of God, is it not? And so what is it about imitating the things of God that made Israel guilty? Chapter 5, verse 4. Their actions do not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of promiscuity is among them, and they do not know the Lord. Right, so we've read about that. There's a promiscuous and idolatrous spirit about them, and they don't know the Lord. Israel's arrogance testifies against them. Both Israel and Ephraim stumble because of their iniquity, and even Judah will stumble with them. And then here's where the imitation comes in. They go with their flocks and herds to seek the Lord, but do not find him, for he has withdrawn from them. Like I said, if you read through the Old Testament, the Israelites were instructed to bring certain animals in offering to God. And so what had happened to the nation of Israel is that they were still doing those things. They were still offering sacrifices like God had told them to do, but here was the problem. God had just become another God to them. And so they thought that if they were to offer sacrifices to these false gods, and they were to continue to do the things that God had told them to do, then it would be presented to God, that God would see it as true worship. But that's not what's happening. Now you see, they knew what to do, and they knew what real worship looked like. And so instead of really worshiping, they simply imitated real worship. They simply imitated what real worship ought to look like. And I think for us today, what this can look like is we know the things of God, don't we? We know the things to do, the right way to sing, the right way to look at the preacher when they're preaching a message. We know the things to post about reading our Bible and the things to pray, right? We know all of the things to do, but are we doing it with the right heart? Or has God simply become just another God to us? Are we imitating real worship, or are we really worshiping? You see, the Israelites had forgotten, had long abandoned the law of God and a desire to know him intimately as his chosen people. But they were still doing the outward, the external things in an attempt to earn God's favor. So, where did all of this lead them to? Where did their idolatry, their ignorance, and their imitation of the things of God lead them to? It resulted in languish. Now, this word languish, if you just take off the L, it's probably a lot easier for us to understand what it means. What does it feel like when you're in anguish? Does anybody know what that feels like? When you want something so badly, or you need something so badly, you need water, you need food, you need to rest, but you just can't achieve that. And you feel like it's just out of reach. You see, that's what this resulted in for the Israelites. This word means to lose vitality. It means to become weak or feeble. Like when you remove a tree from the ground or a plant from the ground, immediately upon removing that plant, it begins to die. And over time, and day after day, that plant becomes weaker and weaker to the point where it wilts and it eventually fades away. And so that's what happened. We see in chapter 4, verse 3. For this reason, because we have abandoned the law of God, because the Israelites have abandoned a knowledge and a desire to know God, the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes. And now it's interesting that this is what was happening to the Israelites, that they were experiencing this sort of loss of vitality, this sort of weakness as a result of their sin. Because we read in verse 10, it says, they will eat but not be satisfied. They will be promiscuous but not multiply. You see, the gods that the Israelites were worshiping were gods of fertility and gods of prosperity and gods of pleasure. And so they thought that if they were to give them what they asked for, they would be able to return a promise of abundant life. And so it is with sin, right? Sin promises that if you give yourself to this person, or you give yourself to this drug or this thing or this action that is sinful clearly, then you're going to experience satisfaction and abundance and fullness and prosperity. But that's not the case. And it's not the case because those things are not sins to give. Abundant life is not the world's to offer you. You see, abundant life belongs to one person and one person only, and his name is Jesus. And so if you are searching for those things in anywhere else, in any other person, any other false god, apart from the one true God in Jesus, you're not going to find them. And so the Israelites thought that they could achieve all of those things, and God reminds them in this passage that those are his to give. That satisfaction, that childbearing, all of those things that these false gods promise, those are his. You see, the world cannot offer what is God's to give. I'm reminded of my own testimony even, and I've shared this with some of you, but some of the most exhausting times of my life, some of the most draining, and times where I felt the most anguished and the most feeble and the most weak were the times where my outward appearance looked like a perfect Christian. I came to church, I sang the songs, I cried during some of them. And so if you would have looked at my life from an outward perspective, you would have thought I would have been thriving and I would have been just fine. But you see, while my outward appearance, while my external actions demonstrated an imitation of worship to God, my heart was sprinting in the opposite direction. And so I would ask you tonight, just if that's what you're feeling, if you are feeling exhausted and worn out and tired, is it because your outward worship doesn't match your inward worship? Are your hands coming to God full of sacrifices and things to show him, look what I'm doing, while your heart is prideful and running in the opposite direction? And if that's the case, then just like the people of Israel, we're going to experience a loss in vitality, a loss of life, a weakness that is associated with sin, not a promise of prosperity. And so, what do we see? That all of these things are still in existence today. They all still exist today. Like I said, we've talked about how the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, we are not that different from them, are we? No, we can look and we can see how ignorance and idolatry and imitation have swept across our nation, our country, our world today. But I imagine that one of these three things, if you take a look at your life for more than 10 seconds, you'll find that you've fallen victim to one of these things as well. I think if we look at our world today, we see that there is an overwhelming and a sweeping ignorance of the things of God. Right? You look at all sorts of things in our world, from politics to public education to the sort of content that is promoted across all the spectrums of social media and TV. It's not godly, right? In fact, it's actually anti-God, and their desire, the desire of the culture of our world today, is to push those things aside. You see, this is the first post-Christian generation. And if you don't know what that means, essentially, this is the first generation to grow up without a common knowledge of the things of God, a common understanding of biblical stories and the person and the character of God. And you see, the reason that is because the overwhelming desire of our world and of sin is to make us ignorant of the things of God, to push aside his law, his word, his path, his direction, so that we can fall, so that we can follow these idols. And that's the other thing that we see. Tucker talked about this on week 1, right? He had the things that were demonstrated on stage, of all these things that we put in front of God in our life. All of the idols that we give our affection and our adoration and our attention to that aren't God. But I think much like the Israelites, it's not that we completely take God out of the picture. We just don't know his law. And so what we don't understand is that God is a jealous God who desires our worship and our worship alone. And so what do? We make God a God among gods for us. We make him just another one on the shelf. And so whenever we need something from him, whenever we desire to show him how good of a Christian we are, we bring our sacrifices to him. All the while, our life is filled with idols and things that we have forsaken our covenant with God for. And then the last one, I think there is an overwhelming amount of imitation of worship in our world today. You see, we continue, and I see people all the time continue, even though they've been ignorant of God, even though they don't know his words, his instruction, his path, his law, or anything about his heart or his character. And although they have all of these other false gods in their life, they continue to look and imitate the life of genuine believers. They continue to look and imitate the things that they are doing in an attempt to put on this face of worship. And I think one of the clearest signs as you're thinking about your own life, one of the clearest ways to tell if you are imitating worship, and I see this all the time, it's Christians who are Christian enough that they want everyone to think they are a Christian, and so they do the things, but not Christian enough to make themselves uncomfortable in worship. Not enough to where they sacrifice and they serve and they share the gospel and they go and they do the things that the heart of a believer desires. And they don't want to make themselves uncomfortable, but they also don't want to tell people that they're not a Christian because they're afraid of what they might think. They don't want to tell people that their faith is not in a good spot or their faith is non-existent at all. And while that is so heartbreaking, I would just encourage you, if that is you today, the greatest thing that you can do in this moment is to stop putting on a face, is to stop pretending as though your heart is postured in worship to God, even though the rest of your life may be. Because you see, while ignorance and idolatry and imitation and all sorts of sin promises a life of abundance, remember, abundance is not sins to offer. You see, life is found in the abundance that Jesus offers. And so I just want to ask you a couple of questions as I close out this talking. Have you been ignorant of God and his word? Just ask yourself for a second. I think many times you can come in here and for 25, 30 minutes you can hear somebody talk or you can sing some songs and you can never ask yourself any of these questions. Have you been ignorant of God and his word? Do you care to know God's word? Do you try to memorize it? Do you seek to understand it and apply it? Do you know God's character? Do you care to know him more? Are you telling other people about his words? Or do you ignore it and write it off when someone tries to strike up a conversation about God's word or ask you about your faith? What's your posture? Have you worshiped idols? And what idols do you worship? What are the things that you spend the most time doing, students? Think about it. Do other things come before God? Are other things placed in front of him? Is it homework? Is it sports? Is it friends? What are the things that you're most passionate about? Are those things God? Are the things that you're most passionate about godly things? Is Jesus who you are most passionate about, or are there other idols in place of him? Are you becoming more like those created things and like the sinful culture around us, or are you becoming more like Jesus? You see, you become like that which you worship. And is your worship of God an external imitation of real worship? Do you come to church just because your family comes? Or do you come because you want to? Are you more concerned with what other people think about your faith than what God thinks about your faith? What is your heart? Not your outward, not your hands. What is your heart like when you sing or pray or read? Are you more concerned with doing the things of God or with being made right with God? You see, do you think that your actions will make you right with God? And so, like I said, just stop pretending. Stop going so fast that you don't acknowledge the situation that you are in, and just ask yourself these questions. And so if the answer to any of these things is not wholehearted worship and devotion to God, then what do we do? What should our response be? Hosea chapter 6. In chapters 4 and 5, there's all of what we just talked about and so much more. And the response in chapter 6 is this: come, let's return to the Lord, for he has torn us and he will heal us. He has wounded us and he will bind up our wounds. And then listen to this prophecy. He will revive us after 2 days, and on the third day he will raise us up. See, it's talking about the Lord Jesus, and the reason that we're even able to respond to the gospel message as we acknowledge our sin is because of this truth. And as we respond in obedience, just like Jesus was raised up on the third day, so we will be raised up also, so that we can live in his presence. Let's strive to know the Lord. For his appearance is as sure as the dawn, and he will come to us like the rain, like the spring showers that water the land. The response to our sin, to our disobedience, is to come to the Lord.